On the morning of June 18th, 1944, the war in Europe was not being won. In the hedgerows outside Carentan, it was barely being survived. At exactly 7:23 a.m., German Sergeant Jacob Mertens stood in the third-floor window of a ruined farmhouse, a predator in his element. Through the scope of his Kar 98K, he watched an American machine gun nest 200 yards away. He had the elevation, the cover, and the tactical advantage. In the last hour alone, his unit's MG-42 had already claimed the lives of 6 American paratroopers. Mertens was calm, fighting a horizontal war of angles and ambush. He leaned forward to issue a command, pointing towards the American lines. He had approximately 40 seconds left to live. Death wasn't coming from the soldiers he was fighting, nor the machine gun nest he was targeting. It was coming from a place that, according to standard military doctrine, didn't exist. 3 miles west, sitting motionless inside a concrete grain silo, not near it, but inside it, was Technical Sergeant Raymond Kozlowski. He had been there for 11 hours with no food, no water, and only a bucket for waste. His Springfield M1903A4 rested on a sandbag after he had dragged himself up a rusted ladder in the darkness. Through a hole he'd cut into the structure with tin snips, he could see the entire German defensive line. From this impossible vantage point, he could see what no general on the ground could see: 37 enemy positions and 14 officers identified by insignia and behavior. For the last 6 days, the German command around Carentan had been disintegrating because someone was hunting their leadership. They had sent patrols sweeping through the tree lines, searched buildings, and questioned civilians, looking everywhere a soldier is trained to look. But they never looked up at the silos. To the German tactical mind, a grain silo was farm equipment, not tactical terrain. That assumption was costing them the Carentan Peninsula. Kozlowski watched Mertens' mouth move through his scope. He saw the German sergeant lean forward, and his crosshairs settled on the iron cross just below Mertens' collar. Ray exhaled halfway, held his breath, and squeezed. The Springfield kicked, and 3 miles away, Mertens dropped before the sound of the shot even arrived. It was Kozlowski's 24th kill. This wasn't West Point tactics. This was farm logic applied to warfare, the kind of thinking that comes from fixing tractors rather than studying manuals. Raymond Kozlowski was not a product of military science. He was a product of Sheboygan County geography. While the strategists in Washington were studying maps of Europe, Ray was studying the claustrophobic interior of a 40-foot concrete tube. As the second of 5 sons on his father's 80-acre dairy farm, he inherited the tasks that broke other men. He mucked stalls and fixed fences, but his specialty was the job everyone else feared: climbing 40 feet up a rusted ladder into the grain silos to break up clogged silage with a sledgehammer. It was dark, it smelled of fermented corn, and it was dangerous. A single shift in the grain could bury a man alive. Ray performed this work without complaint, spending hours alone in the dark with his thoughts, inadvertently mastering the very skills: silence, isolation, and comfort in high, confined spaces that would later baffle German intelligence. But his education wasn't limited to the silo. Ray learned the art of the kill on his uncle's farm, hunting groundhogs that dug holes cattle could step in. The army manual taught ballistics, but groundhogs taught patience. His uncle paid a nickel per tail, a bounty that turned Ray into a precision instrument by the time he was a teenager. At age 13, he dropped his first best at 200 yards, a distance his uncle had to walk off to believe. By 15, Ray was the best shot in the county, culminating in a state youth championship trophy in 1937 that his mother proudly displayed on the mantel. His father, a pragmatist hardened by the Depression, was less impressed, noting simply that shooting was fine, but cows needed milking. When the war arrived in 1941, Ray was 22 and classified as an essential agricultural worker, exempt from the draft. He stayed behind while 3 of his cousins enlisted, but the reality of the conflict hit home the following spring when one of those cousins returned in a flag-draped coffin. The guilt was inescapable. In October 1942, Ray walked into the recruiting office in Sheboygan, a decision that caused his father to stop speaking to him for 2 weeks. Ray arrived at basic training at Camp McCoy, already a master of his craft. Marksmanship instructors were immediately baffled by his performance. Every shot hit center mass, regardless of the distance. When asked where he had learned to shoot like that, Ray didn't cite a mentor or a club. He simply answered, groundhogs. The Army, recognizing a resource they didn't need to train, sent him to sniper school at Fort Benning. He graduated second in his class, bested only by a competitive shooter from Colorado. But while the competitive shooter cared about rankings, Ray cared about effective range and wind compensation. He didn't know it yet, but he was carrying a skill set that no drill sergeant could teach: the patience of a farmer and the vertical logic of a silo climber. By April 1944, Ray was in England with the 82nd Airborne Division, assigned to Headquarters Company as a designated marksman. But the war he found on the ground wasn't the one he had trained for. The crisis began on D-Day +7, June 13th, as the 82nd pushed toward Carentan. The German resistance here wasn't just stubborn, it was professional, lethal, and horrifyingly coordinated. Machine gun nests were supported by mortar teams, and hovering over it all was a net of sniper overwatch that turned the hedgerows into a shooting gallery. The American advance was bleeding out, not from massed assaults, but from specific surgical removals. The Germans were executing a systematic dismantling of the American command structure. Radio men were the first targets, officers second, and anyone seen giving an order was third. It was a clinical approach to warfare that rendered standard American doctrine useless. You cannot suppress an enemy you cannot see, and you cannot maneuver against a ghost. The reality of this invisible war hit Ray with brutal intimacy at 9:15 a.m. on that first morning. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, a boy Ray knew from Sheboygan, though of no relation, took a bullet through the throat. Eddie's last words were a gurgled cry for his mother before he bled out in 40 seconds. Ray spent 20 minutes scanning the tree line for the shooter, but the German was simply not there. 2 hours later, Corporal James Devlin, Ray's roommate from England and his card-playing partner for 3 months, died leading a squad across an open field. A single shot to center mass dropped him before he ever heard the rifle report. By June 14th, the 82nd had lost 11 men to precision rifle fire. This wasn't the work of artillery or machine guns. It was the result of a terrifying geography. The Germans possessed the elevation. They were firing from church steeples, barn lofts, and water towers, dominating the flat terrain below. American doctrine dictated that infantry should advance under the cover of tank support and artillery suppression. But in the Norman bocage, that book was worthless. Tanks couldn't elevate their main guns high enough to hit the steeples, and artillery was being diverted elsewhere. The infantry was left to die in the dirt, pinned down by shooters who were untouchable. The breaking point arrived on June 15th. Lieutenant Marcus Freeman, the officer responsible for coordinating the sniper teams, was killed at 3:20 p.m. Ray was only 50 yards away when he saw Freeman's head snap back. He immediately traced the angle of the shot to a second-floor farmhouse window and moved to counter-snipe. But by the time Ray reached a firing position, the window was empty. The German was gone. That night, Ray couldn't sleep. He was haunted by the faces of Eddie, Devlin, and Freeman, but his mind was also working on the tactical problem. The Germans weren't just lucky. They were using the terrain correctly: elevation, concealment, and multiple hides. The Americans were trying to fight a vertical war from the ground level, and it was suicide. To stop the killing, Ray realized he didn't need a bigger gun or more backup. He needed to stop thinking like a soldier and start thinking like a farmer. At dawn on June 16th, Ray walked through the captured territory, studying the landscape with eyes that were no longer looking for cover, but for opportunity. To the average infantryman, the Norman bocage was a nightmare of hedgerows and kill zones. To the German commanders, it was a chessboard of stone farmhouses and church steeples, traditional, obvious strong points. But Ray saw something else. He saw a landscape defined by agriculture, dotted with tall concrete cylinders ranging from 20 to 40 feet high, grain silos. Most of these structures were abandoned, standing like silent sentinels over empty fields. The Germans for all their tactical brilliance, had completely ignored them. In the rigid hierarchy of military value, a church tower offered elevation and spiritual authority. A barn loft offered space and cover. A silo, however, was just a piece of farm equipment. It was an industrial tube designed to hold corn, not soldiers. To the German tactical mind, it was irrelevant terrain. That assumption would cost them the Carentan Peninsula. Ray stopped at an old concrete construction that rose 32 feet into the grey morning sky. A rusted ladder clung to the exterior, flaking under his hands as he began to climb. When he reached the top, the view was a revelation. From this height, the confusing maze of hedgerows resolved into a clear map. He had 3 miles of visibility. He could see every crossroads, every hedge, and crucially, every position the Germans were currently using to kill his friends. He spotted the church steeple 2 miles north, the barn loft 1 mile east, and the water tower to the northeast. From the ground, those German positions were invisible monsters. From the top of the silo, they were exposed targets. But the true genius of the silo wasn't just the view, it was the protection. Ray dropped through the rusted hatch into the dark, sweltering interior. The cylinder was 15 feet in diameter, smelling of old grain and bird droppings, but the walls were the real prize. 3 feet of concrete, reinforced with steel. It was a prefabricated fortress. German machine guns could chew through a barn wall in seconds. They would barely scratch this. Ray examined the ventilation slots running up the wall, small rectangular openings, 6 inches wide by 4 inches tall, spaced every 10 feet. He looked through one. It was perfect. He could see out, but nobody, absolutely nobody, could see in. The Germans were scanning for muzzle flashes in windows and movement in tree lines. They weren't looking for a sniper firing through a 4-inch slit in a concrete tube. Buildings were obvious. Silos were invisible. Ray realized that he was standing inside a weapon that no military strategist had considered. However, realizing the potential was one thing, making it work was another. Silo shooting wasn't in any army manual. The army trained snipers for ground hides and natural camouflage, not vertical concrete tubes. If he did this, he would be inventing a new doctrine on the fly, and the risks were severe. The interior was a trap. If he was discovered, there was no back door, no escape route. He would die alone in the dark. He spent the rest of the day preparing, treating the war like a harvest that couldn't be rushed. He found an abandoned silo 2 miles from the German lines and climbed up with his rifle to run the math. The shooting geometry was radically different here. Firing at a steep downward angle of 40 degrees changed the physics of the bullet's flight. Gravity affected the trajectory differently than on flat ground. Ray fired test rounds into empty fields, adjusting his holdover calculations until he understood the drop. He then turned his attention to the structure itself. The ventilation slots were too narrow for a scoped rifle to traverse effectively, so he took a pair of tin snips and widened a slot, turning the 6-inch opening into a 10-inch firing port, just enough room for the barrel, and the inertial scope, but small enough to remain hidden. The interior was an oven. The June sun baked the concrete, and Ray sweated through his uniform in an hour. He realized he would need logistics to survive the nest. Massive amounts of water, food that wouldn't spoil, and a bucket for waste. He would have to remain perfectly still for hours, perhaps days, suspended in a concrete twilight. The Germans were looking for a soldier. Ray was preparing to become a fixture of the farm itself. On the evening of June 16th, Ray approached Captain Robert Henshaw with a proposal that sounded like suicide. The unit had lost 11 men to snipers in 3 days, and Henshaw was desperate, but he was also pragmatic. When Ray suggested occupying the silos, Henshaw frowned, calling them death traps, where a man could be trapped and killed without hope of rescue. Ray's response was simple and irrefutable. "I grew up in them, sir. I know how they work." Henshaw authorized the mission, but made the stakes terrifyingly clear. Ray would be on his own. No support, no backup, and if he died, no one was coming to retrieve his body. The loadout for this mission wasn't standard infantry issue. It was a curated toolkit for a long siege. At 9:45 p.m. on June 17th, Ray packed his gear in the darkness. He took his Springfield M1 Nano 3A4, with a universal scope, a weapon capable of surgical precision. He packed 200 rounds of M2 armor-piercing ammunition, bullets designed to punch through the engine blocks of trucks, which would make short work of officers hiding behind cover. But the rest of his kit revealed the true nature of the operation: 4 canteens of water, 6 de-rationed chocolate bars, a folding shovel, 50 feet of rope, and most critically, a pair of tin snips. He also packed a bucket. It was a grim necessity. Once he was up that ladder, he wouldn't be coming down for days. Ray slipped through the Allied lines at 11:20 p.m., telling the sentries he was on patrol, and disappeared into the no-man's land between the armies. He moved northwest, avoiding roads, and freezing whenever German voices drifted over the hedgerows. His target was a silo 3.5 miles from American lines and 2 miles deep into German territory. Ditorsep, concrete cylinder standing 38 feet tall against the night sky. The climb was the first test. The exterior ladder was rusted, flaking off under his hands, and every rung groaned under his weight. 38 feet up, a single slip meant death. When he reached the top, the hatch was seized by corrosion. Ray had to pry it open with the handle of his shovel, the sound of metal on metal screeching into the night, forcing him to freeze and listen for reaction. There was none. He dropped into the black void of the interior. Inside, the silo was a sensory paradox. The concrete walls held the day's heat, keeping the interior warm, but as the night wore on, the stone sucked the warmth from his body. Ray set up in the northeast quadrant, 32 feet off the ground. He found a ventilation slot, but the 6-inch opening was too narrow for his needs. For 20 minutes, he worked with the tin snips, widening the steel-reinforced slot to 12 inches wide and 8 inches tall. The metal shrieked with every cut, forcing him to pause and listen, terrified that the noise would draw a patrol. Once the nest was built, the challenge shifted from engineering to trigonometry. Ray arranged sandbags to create a stable firing platform, but the angle was severe, 42 degrees downward. Any shooter knows that gravity affects a bullet differently when firing at a steep angle. If he aimed dead on, the bullet would hit high. He had to calculate a complex holdover, adjusting his aim to compensate for the geometry of the shot. He couldn't lay prone. The angle was too steep. He couldn't stand. He would be visible. So he knelt, wrapping himself in wool blankets to cushion his joints against the concrete floor, settling in for a wait that would test the limits of human endurance. Ray waited through the night, staring into the darkness, thinking about the groundhogs back in Wisconsin. At 4:47 a.m., the sky began to gray. By 5:30 a.m., the German positions revealed themselves exactly where he had mapped them. The discipline required now was absolute. At 6:12 a.m., a German soldier walked out to a well to draw water. Ray had him dead to rights, but he didn't pull the trigger. Enlisted men were not the target. Shooting a private would alert the officers, sending them into hiding. Ray let him live. At 6:58 a.m., a sergeant appeared. Ray let him live too. He was waiting for the head of the snake. At 7:19 a.m., the target presented itself. Lieutenant Klaus Becker, a man known for his aggression, stepped out of a church wearing his officer's cap and carrying binoculars. He walked into the open to scan the American lines. Through the universal scope, Ray saw him clearly. The range was 820 yards. The wind was drifting 3 to 5 miles per hour. The angle was 40 degrees down. Ray's mind processed the data instantly. He adjusted his point of aim, 4 inches right for the wind, 2 inches high, to compensate for the trajectory. He controlled his breathing, in, out, hold. The Springfield roared, the sound amplifying inside the concrete tube like a cannon blast. Through the scope, Ray watched the physics of his preparation take effect. The M2 armor-piercing round punched through Becker's sternum. The lieutenant folded, grabbing his chest and falling backward. It was a perfect shot, engineered by tin snips, rust, and a farmer's understanding of angles. Ray cycled the bolt, caught the hot brass casing in his hand to leave no evidence, and settled back against the cold concrete. The experiment was a success. Now, the harvest could begin. The death of Lieutenant Becker at 7:19 a.m. did not immediately break the German defense, but it introduced a fatal variable: confusion. Ray watched through his scope as two soldiers rushed to the fallen officer, dragging him behind a stone wall. They were too late. The round had done its work, but their reaction revealed their blindness. The German unit immediately initiated standard counter-sniper doctrine: locate, suppress, assault. They scanned the east, searching the tree lines and the hedgerows. They sent patrols sweeping toward farmhouses and a nearby church. They were looking for a soldier at ground level, hiding in the bushes. They never tilted their heads back to look at the concrete tower looming over them. Ray waited. He cycled the bolt of the Springfield, ejected the casing, and let the silence return to the silo. He knew exactly what was happening inside the German command post. The radio chatter would be frantic, reporting an officer down from unknown fire. They would need to coordinate a response, and coordination requires communication. Communication requires a radio, and a radio requires an operator. At 8:33 a.m., Captain Hauptmann Schultz stepped out of a stone farmhouse, a radio handset pressed to his ear. He was doing his job, reporting the situation to higher command, perhaps requesting artillery support to flatten the suspected American positions. But to get a clear signal, or perhaps simply out of habit, he walked into the open. The range was 140 yards. Ray adjusted his aim, 6 inches right, 3 inches high, and fired. Schultz dropped the handset and clutched his throat, dead before he hit the ground. Now, the panic was visible. Ray had killed the man giving the orders, and the man reporting the deaths. The German unit was effectively blind and deaf. Soldiers scattered, sprinting between buildings, diving into ditches. The discipline of the Wehrmacht was dissolving into the survival instinct of terrified individuals. But Ray wasn't done. At 9:15 a.m., he spotted a familiar face in a third-floor window: Sergeant Jacob Mertens. This was the machine gunner who had tormented the Americans for days, the man responsible for the deaths of Ray's friends. Mertens was leaning forward, pointing, trying to rally his men and direct fire. Ray didn't hesitate. At 780 yards, he put a bullet through the window. Mertens' head snapped back, and the machine gun fell silent. 3 key leaders dead in under 3 hours. The German defense was now in crisis. Officers refused to show themselves. Sergeants were trying to lead from deep cover, shouting orders that went unheard in the chaos. The system of the German army, built on rigid hierarchy and clear chains of command, was collapsing because the links in that chain were being snapped one by one. Then, at 10:02 a.m., the prize arrived. A Kübelwagen staff car tore down the dirt road and skidded to a halt behind a farmhouse. 3 officers spilled out, 2 captains and a colonel carrying a map case. This was senior leadership coming forward to personally assess the disaster. It was a rare, high-value target, and Ray's pulse quickened. The colonel moved towards the farmhouse door, a distance of 20 feet. Ray had 5 seconds. The range was 950 yards. The wind had picked up to 6 miles per hour. Ray compensated 8 inches left and 2 inches high. He fired. The colonel staggered, his hand gripping the doorframe for a fraction of a second before he collapsed. The 2 captains dragged him inside, but Ray had seen the blood spray from center mass. By noon, the German force facing the 82nd Airborne was leaderless. The tactical structure had been decapitated. Throughout the rest of the day, Ray continued his work, dismantling the remnants of authority. When a lieutenant tried to direct a mortar team at 1:47 p.m., Ray killed him. When a staff sergeant tried to organize an ammo resupply at 3:25 p.m., Ray killed him. When a second lieutenant tried to lead an assault at 5:19 p.m., Ray killed him. By sunset, the German army in that sector had ceased to function as a cohesive military unit. They had plenty of rifles, plenty of ammunition, and plenty of soldiers, but they had no one left to tell them when to shoot. Innovation in warfare rarely comes from the top down. It bleeds from the bottom up, usually started by men who are trying to keep their friends alive. For the first few days, Ray Kozlowski was a ghost story. By June 19th, Staff Sergeant Tommy Reeves had counted 16 dead German officers in 3 days, all dropped by precision fire from an unknown location. Reeves scanned the buildings and the tree lines, but the geometry didn't make sense. When he asked Captain Henshaw about the phenomenon, He received a cryptic warning: keep that observation to yourself. Someone who understands farming is doing it. Reeves, a rancher from the American West, didn't need a diagram to understand the hint. That night, he watched a silo in the distance. He saw nothing. But the next morning, when another German officer fell, Reeves climbed a tree and realized the silo was the only structure that aligned with the trajectory. He approached Ray at the command post 2 days later. The conversation was brief. Reeves asked if anyone could do it. Ray, looking at a man who understood the solitude of rural life, simply replied, anyone who's not claustrophobic, bring water, bring patience. The secret was out. It didn't travel through official memos or briefings. It spread like a bonfire through the whispered network of the enlisted men. By June 25th, 4 American snipers were operating from silos across the Carentan Peninsula. By July the 2nd, there were 17. The results were statistically impossible to ignore. Before Ray entered his first silo, American snipers in Normandy averaged 1.3 confirmed kills per week, with officer kills being a rarity. 3 weeks after the tactic spread, that number jumped to 4.7 kills per week, and the rate of German officer casualties tripled. More importantly, American casualty rates from German precision fire dropped by 45%. The hunters had become the hunted. The Germans were baffled. On July 4th, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane photographed American positions. The analyst noted multiple silos within striking distance of the front lines, but dismissed them as farm structures with no tactical value. It wasn't until July 18th, a full month after Ray's first kill, that American intelligence intercepted a German transmission finally identifying grain storage as a lethal threat. By then, it was too late. The fear of the silo ghost had forced German officers to whisper commands and hide in bunkers, degrading their tactical effectiveness by an estimated 40%. The US Army was slower to catch up than the Germans. In August, 2 engineers were sent to investigate the phenomenon. They climbed the silos, interviewed the snipers, and wrote a glowing report recommending the tactic for other theaters. That report sat on a desk in Washington for 7 weeks, ignored by a leadership structure that was focused on tanks and aircraft. It wasn't until 1946 that the Army officially codified the lesson Ray Kozlowski had taught them. The revised field manual, FM 23-10 Sniper Training and Employment, included a new section on non-traditional elevated positions. On page 43, in a single paragraph, it referenced agricultural storage facilities as potentially useful. There was no mention of the dairy farmer from Wisconsin, no mention of the 28 officers he killed, and no mention of the tin snips. The innovation was absorbed into the machine, but the man who invented it was already back in Sheboygan, milking his cows. Ray Kozlowski survived the war. When the guns finally fell silent, on May 8th, 1945, he was in Germany, having confirmed 28 officer kills across 11 months of combat. He was never wounded, he was never captured, and despite changing the tactical landscape of the European theater, he never received a medal for what he did in those silos. He didn't want one. He returned to Wisconsin in August 1945, taking a bus from New York back to Sheboygan. There was no parade. His father met him at the station. They didn't hug, they shook hands. His father asked one question: "Are you ready to work?" Ray simply said, "Yes." For the next 42 years, Ray farmed the same 80 acres of dairy land he had grown up on. He married Elizabeth Warner in 1947, raised 3 children, and never spoke about the war. When neighbors or family pressed him, he would only say, "I did my part." In 1963, a reporter from the Milwaukee Journal tracked him down, looking for the silo sniper of Normandy. Ray declined the interview, stating he had cows to milk, and hung up the phone. The ghost of the war only surfaced in small, quiet moments. In 1981, at his mother's funeral, his daughter noticed the old 1937 State Youth Shooting Championship trophy still sitting on the mantel. She asked if she could keep it. Ray looked at the object that had once defined his identity and nodded, telling her quietly, "It was from before I knew what shooting meant." The only validation Ray ever accepted came in 1978. At a reunion of the 82nd Airborne, he ran into Tommy Reeves, the rancher who had been the first to copy his technique. Reeves, now an old man himself, thanked Ray. He told him that the silo technique had saved his life during the advance through Belgium. Ray nodded and said he was glad. They never discussed it again. Ray retired in 1987 and passed away years later, a quiet man who spent his final days gardening and playing checkers. But his legacy is written in the survival of 200 American soldiers who came home because German officers were too terrified to stand up. It is written in the Army field manuals that still reference agricultural structures today. Ray Kozlowski was not a hero in the way the movies define them. He was a farmer who saw a problem, pests digging holes in his field, officers killing his friends, and fixed it with the tools he had: patience, elevation, and a rusted ladder. He didn't fight for glory. He fought so he could go back to the only thing that mattered, the 80 acres of silence in Sheboygan County. And when the job was done, he put down the rifle, picked up the milk pail, and went back to work.